Hello, it's Aaron Wren. Today's show, I have special guest Dean Ball. He's a research fellow on AI and progress at the Mercatus Center. He also publishes a Substack called Hyperdimensional on those topics. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And also, importantly, he and I worked together when we were both back at the Manhattan Institute, working in state and local policy there. So it's good to see you again, Dean. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. Good to be talking.
I don't typically talk too much about technology today, although I follow it. I started off my career in technology, and I still do a little software development, believe it or not. But this artificial intelligence revolution has gotten so much press and so much hype. I thought it'd be a good thing for us to discuss because it really is going to be affecting our world in some way, shape, or form going forward. So I guess for my audience, which is probably mostly non-technologists, can you just give them a sense of what is AI?
Yeah, so AI is a discipline that encompasses a huge range of different academic fields: statistics, philosophy, computer science, many different areas. It's been around since the 50s. The original idea of AI was essentially, what is intelligence? What is it for a human being to have the generally flexible, fluid intelligence that we sort of obviously possess? And there have been many different approaches to trying to solve this problem. Early versions of AI looked like basically sort of like a series of rules, right? So if we can just write down all the rules of how to answer different questions or the right move to make in a chess game, well, then we can, eventually it must all boil down to a list of rules that can be written down. It turns out that isn't really true for most sufficiently complex problems. That's how traditional computers are programmed, a bunch of rules. But it turns out that for the fluid intelligence that a human being or an animal has, it's not quite like that. It's more probabilistic than it is deterministic. And so in the 90s, this new approach called neural networks was invented. These are basically mathematical structures that are kind of loosely modeled on the way that neurons in the brain work. These neural networks showed some promise in the 90s, but ultimately didn't do all that much. And the current revolution that we're seeing in AI started around 2012, when researchers realized that those same neural networks from the 90s, if you just put a lot more data than we did in the 90s and a lot more computing power than we did in the 90s, all of a sudden start to be able to work to do some pretty interesting things. Started with image recognition, and then it sort of moved on to being able to have superhuman performance at board games like chess and Go. Go is a Chinese board game known for its complexity and sort of huge range of possible moves. You could never boil it down to simple rules. And now to mastering domains like language, generating images, generating videos, many different things. Obviously, things in the sciences as well. And so it's all there. There are many different things within this field called deep learning, and it's called deep learning because it's a deep neural network. It's a neural network with many layers in it. Again, kind of, if you squint, structurally similar to the human brain. And that's basically what's driven essentially all of the capabilities that we have seen over the last decade.
So when I have an AI app that does text to speech or an AI app that does the opposite, it turns what we're discussing into a transcript, or the AI that drives Waymo self-driving cars, or the AI in ChatGPT that will answer questions in sort of free-form text, are those basically all applications of the same underlying technology, or do any of them have like fundamentally different technologies under them?
The exception I would draw there is the Waymo self-driving cars. Waymos have a combination of neural net-based solutions and also sort of more deterministic, very complex, but more deterministic algorithms and other forms of machine learning as well in them. So I'd say Waymo would be the one exception, although I would also say if you look at, for example, Tesla's full self-driving solution, that's a good example of something that is what's called an end-to-end neural network. So that's using deep learning basically entirely. And that's why a Tesla full self-driving vehicle can, in principle, drive anywhere in the world. Whereas the Waymos are very specific geographies. They have to map in an incredible level of detail every single inch of the cities that they drive in. So you only see Waymos in a few cities, whereas Tesla's full self-driving solution can be anywhere. And like the thing about the thing that's so important to understand about the way that this end-to-end neural network solution works is, if a Tesla full self-driving, the most modern version of Tesla's full self-driving, if that stops at a stop sign, nobody ever programmed into it, this is a stop sign and you're supposed to stop. It learned that by looking at a lot of data of humans driving and sort of figured that out and has a representation in its neural nets for what a stop sign is.
Yeah, well, is this AI hype or is it real? And I ask that because I've been hearing for years, going back to self-driving cars, there was big hype around self-driving cars. It's going to put all the truck drivers out of business. Mm-hmm. For example, Uber was developing self-driving technology. They're like, well, it's going to be all driverless Ubers. And now we're hearing that, it's going to put Hollywood out of business, or it's going to put a lot of people out of business, as you don't need as many software developers. You need fewer software developers, and just AI will write all the software for you with these sort of Copilot or other apps. Mm-hmm. What do you see as like the reality versus the hype on AI?
I think that the reality is that AI is a very powerful way of being able to model and exercise precise control over aspects of the world that previously eluded our kind of rational analysis. And so I think the way to think about it, though, is probably as enabling fundamentally new capabilities, just as much, if not more, than it replaces existing things. So like the example of movies is a really good one. In theory, one could imagine an AI-generated Hollywood movie. But that's probably not where things will actually go. One of the things we see in technology history is that technology doesn't often just wholesale replace what came before. It kind of gets layered on top in almost like an archaeological fashion. And so I would think, what are the completely new things that people can do with these AI-generated videos? And that will just take time to figure out. That's like a sort of market-oriented discovery process that will take substantial time to figure out. I think the same thing is true. I mean, there's going to be labor market displacement. There already is. We're already seeing that. There will be jobs that are lost. There will also probably be jobs that in an alternate reality would have been hired for that just don't get hired for because companies have internal processes that sort of automate those functions. But I think it's going to be a combination of sort of new and replacing the old. So I guess in short, I would say I think the hype is real, but probably misunderstood by many people, just because the relationship between society and technology is really, really complicated to understand, and anticipating where these things are going to go is really hard. But, I think also one thing to keep in mind in terms of the hype is that as much as people love the generative AI, the language models, the image generators, things like that, that's not all AI is. It's also being used in really dramatic ways in the sciences to do things that were never before possible. So whether you're talking about discovering new materials to push forward things like nuclear fusion, or discovering new kinds of drugs with models that can predict the structure of proteins, which was a famously impossible scientific challenge up until a few years ago. These are all new capabilities that are coming online all the time. I think a few months ago, a group of scientists used AI to identify hundreds of thousands of new candidates for antibiotics. We haven't discovered a new class of antibiotics since the 70s, and we're discovering now hundreds of thousands of them. Same thing is happening in material science. So I think that the hype in the sciences is probably underrated, and the hype in the language models is maybe a little overrated.
Yeah, you had an article, maybe just came out today in the New Atlantis, where you talked about these fusion reactors, and I guess I just read about there's been this breakthrough in controlled fusion. Did you get more energy out of it than you put into it? And part of that was because the way that they do fusion in these reactors that have these plasma fields, they're using AI to stabilize the plasma fields. Mm-hmm. So that it will, not bleed out energy or have irregularities that cause problems. And that was something that couldn't be done simply by human design software. It took this adaptive AI mm-hmm. to, in real time, control all the anomalies in this plasma field through magnetic adjustments. Very interesting application there.
Yeah. Oh, it's super cool. There's a company called Helion, which is actually backed by Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI. And what they do is they take this plasma, super heated gas, they heat it to 1,000,000 degrees, form it into like almost a 3D donut shape at 1,000,000 degrees, floating, basically levitating because of magnets. And then very advanced exotic magnets that are controlled by AI. So this whole thing is being controlled by AI. And then they fire the donuts at one another at 1,000,000 miles an hour to create basically the same mechanism that goes on inside of our sun to produce its energy. They're doing that in human design machines that fit inside of a normal warehouse. So it's pretty incredible. And it's the kind of thing where the science to do that in principle was possible, but we just simply didn't have the control mechanisms. And so AI is giving us the control mechanisms to do that.
Now, I have to confess, I have struggled to find uses for AI in my own work. Now, I haven't put huge effort into it, but I did go out and use ChatGPT-3. And what can I use this for? Can I get it to maybe draft something that I could modify mm-hmm. and turn into a post? And what I discovered was I really couldn't find a great use for it. One of the problems I ran into, and this is a known problem, is what they call hallucinations. AI just makes stuff up. Mm-hmm. So anything that it says, you have to validate that it's real. It'll mm-hmm. even make up scientific papers in scientific journals with fake authors and fake titles that look like a totally legitimate reference, but it just made it up.
Yeah.
And it also didn't include links to anything. So it wasn't even easy. It's like if it would reference something, I'd try to use it to give me articles. It couldn't do that. It seemed to be worthless as a search engine. I'm like, search could be great. And so I've used Grok AI, which is Twitter's AI. Mm-hmm. And Twitter search is horrible to find tweets. I'm like, maybe I could learn interesting things from Twitter just by asking questions of Grok. Well, Grok doesn't even return tweets very well. So I struggled to get any sort of search use out of it. I use it to, really because it's built in, you basically can't, you have to go around and turn it off. It'll do transcripts of podcasts, which I am using it for because it's in a sense good enough, but it's not great. I was commissioning actual transcripts for my podcast, which I stopped, and people have told me that was a complaint. Because it's the new transcripts aren't as good. I'm like, well, they're a lot cheaper and they're a lot faster. So there's that. And then one I just tried today for the first time. I had an AI service that would do text to speech. So it would create essentially an audio version of my post in a cloned version of my voice. And it's okay. It's not great. It's got some errors in it. And certainly its imitation of me wasn't very good compared to its built-in voices. But there's little things there, but I'm struggling to like find a game-changing application for it in my own work. I'm wondering, do you actually find any use for AI in your work, or like what would people like us actually be using it for?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would say about that is it's tempting, but probably a mistake to think of language models like ChatGPT as being first and foremost search products. It's a little bit like if you read a book, the expectation is not that you will have memorized every single fact and sentence in the book. Instead, the expectation is that you will have formed thoughts on it and connected it to other things that you know about, other ideas. And that's like, in a way, that's modeling text. You are modeling the text. You are incorporating the text of that book into your broader world model. And that's kind of what we want language models to do. So one of the counterintuitive things is that when a language model just spits out things that it has memorized, because they do that. They do memorize stuff sometimes. When they just do that, though, that's actually an example of a failure mode. And the hallucinations are actually, in a sense, what you want. You want them to be creative and kind of not just regurgitating stuff. Now, you want them to be creative and not regurgitate stuff while also being grounded in factual matter. And that's the complexity. So I think that the language models are just going to get better at this. I think that's a huge area of research right now. But one of the things I would say about that is, like, if you can ground a model in something that you want to explore that's factual, that really helps. So one of my main uses for language models in my day-to-day job is reading papers. So I'm able to, look at maybe 10, 15 times more academic papers than I was before language models, because I'll just take the PDFs and put them into, a language model and kind of talk to the language model about it. And the most modern language models do a great job of that. That's one other thing I would say is the progress in AI is so rapid. It is important to make sure you're as much as you can using the latest and greatest stuff. So from OpenAI, that's GPT-4. Anthropic's Claude 3.5 is a very well-regarded model. Meta has a new model called Llama 3.1, super well-regarded. So these things are super powerful for just like grinding through lots of PDFs. Another thing that I do, I keep a document that has everything I've ever written for public audience in it. And sometimes I'll, maybe there's like an application for something, some sort of project or like a abstract that I need to write or something. I will take the abstract, put it into a language model, and then take the document with everything I've ever written, put that in, and say, here's something that I want to do. Here's the topic I'd like to do it on. Like, here's the proposal I want to have. Just like write a quick proposal for me that's in my writing style and based, like, sort of inspired by the things that I'm interested in, judging from my writing. They'll do a great job at that because you're grounding the model. So that's the that I would say is like the art of it. But yeah, I kind of always joke that language models are a little bit like the piano, the easiest instrument to pick up and kind of the hardest to master. Because sure, like you can just say whatever you want to it and it will respond and it will happily BS you a lot of the time. But how do you actually get good responses out of it takes a little bit more finesse.
I think of AI and I immediately think of science fiction scenarios. Mm-hmm. One of them is the Star Trek Universal Translator. And AI will already translate between languages, I guess. It powers some of the online things. Do you think one day we'll have like real-time audio level translation so that, you and I could be having a conversation in different languages and we wouldn't need to speak each other's languages. We could just talk to each other?
Yeah, in fact, that already exists. That capability already exists from a bunch of different people. So yeah, for sure. I mean, assuming, if we're speaking some very exotic language that there's not a lot of training data on the internet for, be a little bit harder. But if you're speaking a major language, then that's already doable in real time.
Yeah, I had a guy come to my house. He ran out of gas and he wanted to borrow a gallon of gas. And he didn't speak English, and he was using his phone. Like maybe it was Google Translate, but he was doing something to try to communicate with me. It didn't really work, but I was able to deduce that he ran out of gas and was able to give him some gasoline.
Yeah.
So that was good there. The other one, of course, is Terminator, where this AI-controlled defense system called Skynet decides that it better kill human beings before human beings kill it and take over the world there. And that's this kind of nightmare scenario of runaway AI destroying, enslaving humanity or exterminating humanity. It's like a science fiction trope, but a lot of people seem to believe it. Elon Musk seems to think that it's an existential threat at some level. And there's an entire movement called, I guess, AI alignment, which is around making sure that doesn't happen. What do you think of these kinds of risks, and what do you think of this AI alignment movement?
Yeah, so AI alignment, it's a little weird. It's in the history of technology. AI alignment and safety research kind of actually predates deep learning by quite a bit. Sort of started in the late 90s, early 2000s as being a major concern. In a certain sense, almost every science fiction movie or book I've ever seen about AI is kind of at a fundamental level about AI alignment. 2001: A Space Odyssey, HAL 9000. That's a movie about AI alignment. And I think that you have to think about alignment in two ways that are kind of fundamentally different. There's the technical aspect of alignment, which is like, is this thing going to do what we tell it to? Does it have ulterior motives? But not even, that would be one rather exotic example, but also just like, is there some subtle goal, subtly different goal that it's optimizing for that's a little bit different from what we want, that we, maybe can't even necessarily say. So that's like a technical problem. And there's a great progress being made on that problem. This is a field, the whole safety field touches on this, AI safety field, but specifically there's an area called mechanistic interpretability, which is basically trying to understand how these models work at a really deep level. So I feel optimistic about our ability to kind of like basically do an MRI on these models all the time as they're functioning and see exactly what's going on. And that's an advantage that we don't have that with humans, right? We can't do that. We can't be looking at every single human neuron with perfect fidelity for 24 hours a day. We can do that with language models, at least in principle. So that's an area of research I'm bullish on. But then there's also this other aspect of alignment. It's sort of like, assume you've mostly solved or completely solved the technical problem. Then the question becomes, well, with whom is this model aligned, right? Like, is it aligned with the people who made it? Is it aligned with the government? Is it aligned with the person who's using it? Is it aligned with, some broad set of like all of humanity, right? Like the goals of humanity, right? Like, what does that mean in a rigorous and detailed sense? And ultimately, I view that as a socio-technical problem that, in a way, I'm comforted by the fact that it sounds a lot like politics. Like at a deep level, it's like, oh, there's different intelligent entities and they want different things and they're competing with one another. And, sort of there's conflict over resources or whatever. Well, it's like, okay, well, that's kind of what society's been dealing with for a long time. So we're not perfect at that. We don't have any perfect answers to that problem, but at least it's something that looks to me like a set of problems I'm familiar with, rather than a completely exotic set of problems. So I think it's two different things. One of them is a technical problem that, some people will tell you we're nowhere close to solving it, and that's why the world is going to end very soon. And they will say that, with almost a religious fervor. I think that's probably not the consensus among most researchers and scientists who study AI. And then there is the socio-technical problem of with whom is the system aligned. And that's one that I think we're just going to muddle through over time, like we do any political challenge.
Yeah, so that's a great, I think, segue over to the regulatory aspects of AI, because it strikes me that the people who are very involved in AI safety and this AI alignment movement, there tends to be a lot of overlap with the effective altruism movement, or certainly there was. And to me, like, effective altruism looks like a totally toxic movement. I mean, Sam Bankman-Fried, the guy who ran FTX, who's now in prison, I guess, was like the poster child of that. And although he's a unique individual, I don't want to overly stigmatize everyone on account of him. It does seem to be based on some very weird, like, hard utilitarian approaches that are not accepted by the majority of people. They also tend to, really don't seem to have any objective way of making decisions, because they care about extremely long-term risks and things like that, highly sensitive to the assumptions you put into the system about that. And seems like, candidly, another group of people who thinks we basically ought to control things. And therefore, they're basically looking to make AI serve their interest in the name of humanity, rather than, what we typically see, which is that the people who create the technology finance it. We have mechanisms that involve regulations and governments, but these guys seem to want to insert themselves into the sort of the control node of this thing, and they don't seem like such a great group of people, in my opinion. Maybe you disagree, but
yeah, effective altruism. I have complicated feelings about this movement. So, I guess a couple things. The effective altruists kind of come out of rationalist thinkers, a rationalist community from the San Francisco Bay Area, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and like London, Oxford area. Those are really the three hubs of it. And these people were thinking about AI and AI risks super seriously a long time ago. And these people are smart, and they made a lot of money over that period of time, over the last 25 years, before effective altruism even existed, well before. These people were thinking about it, and then a lot of them made quite a lot of money because they're very smart and they're lucky. They used some of that money to form a network of nonprofits and other organizations that are devoted to AI. And so when policymakers and other people started to get very worried about AI, well, if you look around, there's the Center for AI Policy, the Center for AI Safety, Center for Governance of AI, all these kinds of groups. And by the way, every single one of those groups would not characterize themselves as effective altruists, because nobody characterizes themselves as effective. Everybody is, I have friends with effective altruists or have received money from. But anyway, I'm just going to say that every single one of those groups has received large grants from effective altruist funding organizations. So like they're kind of the official policy, not official, but they look like they have very official sounding names. And it's like, these are the experts. And you don't actually know if you're a policymaker and you're not familiar with this lineage, which has to do, by the way, with like kind of like very quirky, like online history. This isn't like an academic thing. This is like blogs and like groups online. It's the first intellectual movement, I think, one of the first that like really cut its teeth online.
And a lot of things came out of it too. It wasn't just this. So like Curtis Yarvin and the neo-reactionary movement emerged from the rationalist community.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think one of the ways to think about like effective altruism, I think the fundamental like flaw in my view, there's a lot of like tiny flaws I can point out, but the big flaw I think is that there are people who pride themselves on having kind of a very mathematical understanding of the world and thinking about probabilities and risk calculations and things like that. The problem, though, is, as you said, they're long-termists. So they think about human beings who have never been born. And they also, importantly, they allow the concept of infinity to enter into the calculations that they make in their minds about risk. And so if the possibility is that AI might extinct the human race, might make the human race go extinct, well, then it has an infinite risk, infinitely high risk, because there'll be an infinite number of potential humans who could have been born 1,000,000 years from now who are not born. And so that means that if there's a 0.01% chance that AI, which they would say is very high, by the way, that, AI is an existential threat, that means that we need to treat it basically like it's 100% chance, because the risk is infinite. And so I think what that kind of results in is that there's an OpenAI employee, policy employee, who described, this was in public, he described this movement as structurally power seeking, which I thought was a good way to put it. A meaner way to put it would be authoritarian, but I actually think structurally power seeking is kind of the better way, which is to say that, like, this is a group of people who've been thinking about this for a long time. They believe that the risk is very, very dire and that we are on the verge of jumping off of a cliff. And they have formed this network, social network of organizations, intellectual network that is very powerful. And so, yeah, there is a certain amount of, like, their policy positions boil down to, me and my friends need to exercise more control over this. And I think that that sounded good in principle to them. And I think it has not played all that well in a lot of policymaking settings.
Yeah. And the other thing about these people is they essentially, everybody in this world, certainly the effective altruist world, but most of them in the AI alignment world, seem to be very firmly ensconced on the political left. And if I look at the resources that are being brought to bear on shaping regulation of AI and just technology in general, but just think about AI. You listed all those organizations. I mean, there is an archipelago of official sounding NGOs backed with big money that are all trying to regulate AI from a sort of left, some kind of left perspective. And of course, deeply intertwined with politics as well. We saw, Sam Bankman-Fried was donating a ton of money to the Democratic Party and very, very different causes, and was purchasing a lot of influence with their wealth, as you said. And the only person I know that comes from a sort of a center-right background at all who is not an actual lobbyist, just straight up a lobbyist, maybe you, working on policy. I mean, like, literally, I remember thinking this a few years ago when we were looking at the way, social media was basically censoring content and the way content flows through Facebook and how that interacts with elections. I don't think there's still a single person anywhere in conservatism that studies that as a serious field of endeavor. It looks to me like there's like a 100x more resources devoted to policy setting on technology in AI on the left than there is on the right. Mm-hmm. Am I exaggerating that?
I actually think a little bit. It depends. It depends on the specific area. So one of the weird things about the East Bay, the sort of rationalist community and the effective altruists, is a lot of them actually have pretty libertarian sympathies. I wouldn't call them like culturally right. But so, I mean, libertarians are like culturally left, really, in a lot of ways. But they definitely do have a lot of libertarian impulses, except for this one issue about which they're kind of authoritarian. And that's an irony that I've pointed out many times. But there's also, I think, what we're seeing right now is as the political chips fall a little bit more, the AI was not partisan coded. I think it's still not. One of my fears is that it will become that way. And that AI safety is going to be something that becomes left coded, and sort of AI acceleration will become right coded. That might just be an inevitable outcome. And frankly, it would be consistent with like the broad sweep of, recent history in the political parties. The left generally likes regulating things and the right kind of generally doesn't. I will say there's also the sort of, you pointed out like this misinformation, sort of like the people who study misinformation online,
Right.
which I agree with you there. That's like 1000%. Like, I mean, in a way, I guess I kind of view that stuff as an orchestrated campaign against right of center thought, in a lot of ways, and sometimes rather explicitly.
Oh, there's no doubt about that.
Yeah. I mean, so like the whole concept of misinformation to me is one that I think, look, if the Europeans want to do it, that's great. They don't have freedom of speech in their countries, but we do in the United States. And like, I have a perfect right to spew as much misinformation as I please. It's the one little bit of regulation that we get to put on the government, and the government hates it. And I guess they know how the rest of us feel all the time. But like the misinformation thing, that whole community of people, the like tech ethics world, that I think became especially big after the election of Trump in 2016, that has also intermingled with the AI safety world. And so you have this like AI ethics field that is kind of more about like, let's make sure the model doesn't ever say anything that could possibly be construed as disparate impact or racist or whatever. And that's
like
actually
the Google Gemini image viewer, where it like inserts racial minority characters into every single scene, and they only shut it down after somebody asked them to create Nazis, and it created a black Nazi, and that was like too much.
Yeah.
But
so in fairness, I think a lot of the people who are really like the people who take long-term AI risk very seriously, existential risk, as it's called, I think those people roll their eyes for the most part just as much as the rest of us do at stuff like Gemini, at stuff like that. I really believe that they do, and they view it as a setback for their cause. But also we'll see, like their cause, I think, is a little bit on the back foot right now. The sort of AI existential risk cause, a little bit on the back foot. So alliances are going to form and political fissures are going to form. And so you might end up seeing those two groups merge closer and closer together over time.
Another group maybe you alluded to was, I guess this label already seems to have gone away, but the effective accelerationists. So this is the group of people who sort of branded themselves the opposite of AI alignment in a sense. And their belief is all of our problems can be solved by accelerating technical progress. And that what we need is to take the regulations off. And definitely, I think there's a little right coding into that, or certainly techno libertarian right. So I think Mark Andreessen of Andreessen Horowitz may be like the main guy behind that. And obviously, he has a huge amount of capital to deploy, and they've raised a bunch of funds to put into AI research. What is your take on that approach?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to like alignment, the effective accelerationists, I think broad strokes, what they would say is that alignment is something that will be achieved by marketplace competition. In other words, like you're not going to spend $1 billion to develop and deploy an unaligned AI model because people won't want to use it. And in fact, like some of the issues you pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, your problems with ChatGPT, not all of them, but some of those things you pointed out are examples of AI alignment failures. And you're saying, like, look, I don't have a lot of use for this because of these things. So that's a good example of like the marketplace is, if AI investment is going to continue at the pace that we're seeing, the marketplace is going to drive it to be more aligned. And so that's why the effective accelerationists would say the main thing we need to be worried about is regulation that results in centralized control. Because if you have centralized control, then there's less competition. And in the worst case scenario, and it's being developed in like a bunker owned by the government somewhere, well, then the government doesn't care about alignment at all. They're not thinking. I mean, they are, but they're not. And so it actually that's the highest risk scenario in their view. And that's an argument with which, frankly, I'm like quite broadly sympathetic at a structural level, right? Like there's also technical research on alignment that needs to happen. But again, I think that technical research is expensive to conduct and is probably best conducted in the context of different research organizations that are allocating capital in different ways, making different bets, different kinds of intellectual directions for this research. And, seeing who's best.
Yeah, again, I'm talking with Dean Ball, the Mercatus Center, who's a researcher on AI there. So we're talking about artificial intelligence. Check out his links in the show notes. Be sure to also hit the subscribe button on my channel and, hit the like button, leave a rating, etc. One of the things from a regulation perspective that I see, I don't know if you say this is alignment or if it's something else, is there do seem to be people who effectively want to cartelize AI by requiring a license from the government to create an AI or putting in such onerous requirements around it that nobody could really start a company in this space unless they already had billions of dollars in the bank. And you were writing about some new California legislation related to that. How do you see the regulations playing out so far at the federal and state level in America?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is for sure, like the people that are from the kind of traditional AI safety world, this sort of effective altruist and rationalist world that we're talking about, a lot of them would say pretty candidly that the safest outcome in their view is a monopoly. And so yeah, that regulation will push in that direction, and they're in favor of that. At least some of them. In terms of where the regulatory picture is, though, I think, I'll stick to the US for the moment. I think there was a much bigger appetite for really onerous regulatory regimes about a year and a half ago, when the initial shock of ChatGPT was still fresh. And you had Chuck Schumer going around asking people what their PDOOM was. PDOOM is a term from this rationalist, effective altruist community, probability of doom. He was asking people that question. Then a year later, he releases this report from the Senate's sort of working group report that doesn't recommend really anything like that. Its recommendation is like, come up with a framework to determine if it might ever be necessary to do this, which is the government's way of saying, like, we don't want to do this right now. And so I think you've seen that really change. And that's because like a deliberate process has gone on. One of the things I worry about, though, is that in the US, we have 50 sovereign entities in the form of states. And a lot of states are considering a lot of legislation. Several hundred bills have been considered. The California bill that you mentioned is probably chief among them in terms of AI regulation. And yeah, I mean, the current dynamic is that a sufficiently large and wealthy state can regulate AI for the entire country. And that is California's intention.
You read a lot about regulation in Europe, and they seem to just have it out for American tech companies, maybe because they don't really have any big tech companies.
Yep.
So they don't feel too bad about regulating them. But they just issued a whole bunch of AI regulations. Just seems like a starter pack to me because they don't fully have it thought out. I think they'd have to be the first person on that. What do you think of the European landscape of regulation and what that means for them in terms of their ability to compete in terms of industry?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's kind of difficult for Americans to understand about European law is that like their lawmaking and legal interpretation process is very different from what we have in the US. In the US, like we conform as a general matter to the letter of the law. We care a lot about what individual words mean and what did that word mean when the law was written. Let's go back to 1783 and look at the dictionary, all that kind of stuff, right? The textualism, originalism, legal tradition. None of that in Europe. Europe is all about, l'esprit du law, the spirit of the law. And so I kind of joke sometimes that it doesn't really matter what the AI Act says, because at the end of the day, the AI Act is creating an institutional apparatus and a set of laws that if Europe is mad at you for something that you did, they're gonna find a way to give you trouble under this law. And if it's not under this law, it'll be under the GDPR or the Digital Services Act or one of the other laws they have. They'll figure out some way to do it. And yeah, I mean, so it is definitely true that there's a ton of work to be done. The AI Act is like, genuinely, maybe a single digit percentage of the work is done, even though the law is passed and in effect. Because every country will have to interpret it. Every EU country will have to interpret it. The EU-wide AI office will also have to issue a lot of guidelines and interpretive documents. So it will be a long time before we figure out what exactly it actually is. But I would say that in and of itself, that level of uncertainty in and of itself is going to be very bad for innovation. And Europe has just an unbelievable number of problems in that regard. Like, the regulatory picture is going to make it very hard for new startups to start there. Will also make it, I think it will really deter American companies from even ever bothering to offer their businesses there. Yeah, their products, their new ones, right? There's companies that are locked in, right? Your Apples, your Googles of the world are locked in and they have to deal with this. But I think you'll see those companies oftentimes not introduce new products there, that we're already seeing that, new products and services. And then startups, I think, will offer their products everywhere in the world except for the European Union. And I think we'll just continue to see that. And then another thing that really hurts Europe is another set of policies that have led to, and strategic miscalculations on their part, that have led to deindustrialization and a lack of electricity. And so, if you look at where the compute, the GPUs all over the world to power AI, is very, very electricity hungry things that everyone's heard about, I think, they're not being bought by and large in the European Union, because the European Union doesn't have the electricity to keep the Eiffel Tower on, much less power, a huge data center. So you're seeing that in China, you're seeing it here, you're seeing it in the UAE, the Gulf states. But you're not so much seeing it in Europe. And I think that's going to continue to be the case. And I think that these tech policy regulations will probably go down in history as kind of the last, the sort of like death spiral of the European Union. I think it will increasingly become, I don't think we will think of Europe of Western Europe as a first world country in 10 years.
Interesting to say that. I did see some people saying on Twitter, making these predictions, that eventually the tech companies are just going to say, okay, great, we're out. Peace out, Europe, we're gone.
Yeah.
And it was this idea that, in Europe, they don't have like American air conditioning. They don't have American, refrigerators and all the stuff that we've got. But they did have American level tech because they were just using our tech. But they're even going to lose access to that if companies walk away. You seem a little sympathetic to that almost.
Oh, I'm very sympathetic to it. Yeah, I mean, I think that the way, there's a lot of people who in America who don't like our big tech companies. That's its own issue. But so they've kind of been sympathetic to the EU's regulation because they just see it as being bad for big tech, and it's like an enemy of my enemy type of thing. Those people have not read those laws, and they don't understand how difficult it makes life for a lot of different people. So yeah, I mean, Apple introduced a set of AI features last month. Yeah, still July, so in June of this year, that will be coming to all of Apple's products. And Apple has said TBD whether we're ever going to release this in the European Union. And that's actually not because of the AI Act. That's because of the Digital Markets Act, which is another bill that is basically a bill that was crafted almost exclusively to regulate Apple. And then Meta has said that their next generation of large multimodal models, kind of their competitor to ChatGPT, that will not come out in the European Union because of problems under the GDPR. So the AI Act isn't even in effect. and Europe's regulation is already stopping the release of AI products on their continent. I can't imagine that AI regulation is going to help that scenario.
Yeah, one more kind of technical question, and then I got kind of a speculative one to wrap us up. So the technical question, you hear a lot about open source AI, and Facebook, their model, or Meta's model is apparently open source. I know what open source means in terms of software. It means I can download the software and compile it myself and run it myself and modify it. What does open source mean in terms of AI? And is it significant? Should we even care about it?
Yeah, so I think it's hugely significant. Open source is kind of, in the context of AI, it's two things. There's open weight and open source. So the first, what's open weight? The weights of an AI model are basically like a set of billions or even trillions of numbers that define that model's capabilities. They kind of, in a substantive sense, are the model. They, however, can be put in a spreadsheet. It is literally just a bunch of numbers. So an open weight model is in the context of software, it's a little bit like releasing the binary of the software, like the binary code, but not the actual like programming code, like the Python code or whatever that you wrote it in. Still enormously useful though. Open weight is still enormously useful. And then open source translates to AI in the sense that it would also include a fully open source AI model would include the weights, associated code used to implement the weights, and which is not that much. And we're talking about maybe a few hundred lines, a few thousand lines in most models. And then the most extreme example of open source would be you also include the training data, because the training data really is the source code in the context of an AI model. Very few, like Meta does not release its training data. Very few people do. Some do. But for the most part, that
maybe because they stole half of it from copyrighted material. It's like
yeah. I mean, it's
huge legal liability if you told them what they actually used on it.
Yeah, it's partially that, and it's partially that sometimes like they might use their own proprietary data that they don't want to release. Like in Meta's case, Meta's not using like user data to train its models, but they might have proprietary data sets of different kinds that they don't want to necessarily release publicly. But why is open source important in AI? Well, it's important for kind of the same reason that it's important in software. First, I'll make the business case. The business case is like open source gives you lots of flexibility. It gives you competitive pricing, right? Like the cost, it still costs money to serve an AI model, regardless of whether it's open source or not. But if you can download it for free and, all the different cloud providers will compete down to the penny to get that as cheap as possible. Now closed source models are very cheap too, but in the long term, that competition may be useful. It gives you flexibility. You can customize it. You can fine tune the model to like specific use cases for your business. If you're concerned about sharing your businesses or your personal proprietary data with a company like OpenAI or Anthropic or Google, then open source is the way to go because you own the model in essence. So, you're not sharing the data that you're putting into the model with any proprietary provider. And then I would also make, there's also like a scientific case, right? Like to be able to do scientific research, like the mechanistic interpretability stuff, other safety research that we were talking about. There's a lot of academics that do this stuff, but in order to be able to really do that, you need to be able to do that MRI style analysis of AI models. And the only way to do that is if you have access to the weights. You can't do that if it's closed source. So releasing very capable models open source allows safety and interpretability researchers who are not inside of the big AI labs to gain insights on how these models work, and hopefully in the long term make them more controllable and deal with any long-term safety issues that we have. And then finally, I would make a philosophical case in the sense that open source software. I'm not going to say that all code is speech. I think that's a complicated legal issue. But I would say that open source software is kind of the software and internet analogy, like translation of the First Amendment into software and the internet, of like, these are my ideas, I can publish them, and I'm going to put them in like this giant library of the internet, and other people can take my ideas and we can build off and kind of like collectively gain knowledge and capability together. Very like core ideas of the Enlightenment and the American founding embedded in that idea. And I think open source is like deeply powerful for that reason. I think at a fundamental level, that's why it's been the scientific case, the business case, the practicality cases that I made, I think are all built on this fundamental philosophical idea. And so, preserving that for what might be the next general purpose information technology, and maybe the most powerful information technology ever developed, seems like a very good idea if we can possibly manage to do it.
My last question is speculative, but it's about the overlap between AI and transhumanism movement. Mm-hmm. And so another one of these, tropes of science fiction, is people start worshiping the computer. You can think of people beginning to worship the AI as a god, and turning to the oracles of AI implicitly become the guide to your life, mm-hmm. For example. Or another one might be uploading your consciousness into a computer. Could I upload my consciousness into a neural network and become immortal mm-hmm. through instantiating myself in some super advanced thing? Now, that one would be way down the road, of course. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on kind of the linkages between AI and transhumanism, and especially in terms of the people involved. I mean, do the people involved in this have sort of transhumanist aspirations for what they're doing?
Many. I wouldn't say that's, I think it's a very contentious issue, but there's plenty of people that are interested in AI that are into transhumanism. And I would also say that, I don't know how true this is anymore, but certainly when the deep learning revolution was getting going, middle of last decade, you saw a lot of senior technologists talk about, this includes Sam Altman of OpenAI, talk about this concept of the merge between man and machine, which is in some sense a transhumanist idea, though I think you can think about it in different ways. I think that certainly worshiping models as gods is if you're familiar at all with theology, and you go and look at like Less Wrong, right? The like rationalist community where a lot of this stuff, this alignment stuff got started. You go look at that, you go look at the way that EA people talk about AI, you will find deep resonance with the way that theologians of the past have talked about God, especially when they talk about AGI and super intelligence, things mm-hmm. of that nature. So there's definitely something there. My guess is that, the actual transhuman thing will be the more subtle stuff that's been happening in my mind for a very long time, right? Like been happening as I see it for a very long time, right? Like I think the iPhone is in some sense a transhumanist device, right? Like kind of almost another organ. I think, a lot of people you see walking around have AirPods in basically all the time. That's sort of a very primitive form of augmentation. And I think we will see, in part because of AI, more and more vivid examples of technology that can do that can augment human senses. You can also view a lot of the stuff going on in biotech, again, be very fundamentally driven by AI, not just an AI story, but being fundamentally driven, right? Like that stuff could easily end up becoming transhumanist too. I've written a lot about neurotechnology, brain-computer interfaces, things like that. That's early days still, but yeah, I think that the actual reality is going to be a little bit more subtle. But there are these ideas out there that strike me. I mean, you see this over and over again in like our comparatively godless society. You see people inventing God without realizing that they're inventing God. Sometimes it's climate change. It can be a lot of different things. I think AGI is like one of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely noticed that the AI crowd, there are basically no religious believers involved in that movement, as near as I can tell. It seems to be a kind of materialist, philosophically materialist ones, and therefore, I think maybe they're searching for a God, and technology becomes your God. And the other one is that they have no concept of the human as a sacred being, and therefore the idea of limits, in a sense, doesn't occur to them in terms of, how we could manipulate the human himself.
They also, I think it's an interesting association of like godlike powers with intelligence, of assuming that like the reason that if there is a God, if we accept that there is a God, that the reason he's God and we're not is that he's much smarter than we are, that's where power comes from. I think that's like an implicit assumption that you see in a lot of the AI risk conversations. And yeah, I mean, I think we are at a moment right now with AI where there are two quite fundamentally different visions. There is the vision of it's going to be everywhere. It'll kind of like subtly enable it, be like electricity, right? Like in a certain sense, like, did I go to the office and use electricity? Is that how I think of like how I spend my time? No, but in another sense, it's true, right? Like there's nothing I do that doesn't involve, electrical fields and like, using electronic devices. Will AI be like that? Will it be like just a general purpose integrated into almost everything and an indelible part of our lives? Or will it be like we create this giant oracle and we like go to the oracle and we ask it our biggest questions and it gives us answers and does things for us? I will say this, one of those, I think the oracle model is much more consistent with the regulated closed source vision, the sort of one true AI. And the open vision is a lot more, is consistent with sort of the more electricity-like idea of it's everywhere and it's dirt cheap and we don't even think about it because like, it costs, I can have this thing output something equivalent to the length of every single book ever written by humans, and it costs 5 cents. Right? Like which one will it be? Or I don't think it will be either one of those things, but I think that's a useful way to dichotomize it to kind of understand the different ways that people are thinking about it.
Well, that was a very stimulating conversation, Dean. I learned some things. So I'm glad that you're able to come on the show. Again, my guest today has been Dean Ball of the Mercatus Center, where he's a researcher on artificial intelligence and public policy related to human progress. Sign up for his Substack. Again, there's a link in the show notes. Dean, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was great.